The second session, titled Immigrants or Refugees, will now begin. Dr. Marie McAuliffe, Head of Migration Policy Research Division at the International Organization for Migration, will be moderating the session. Dr. McAuliffe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the Asan Institute, and particularly to Dr. Chung for the invitation to participate in this event and participate in this panel and moderate the panel on migration. Thanks are also extended to the wonderful organisational team at Asan Institute. It's been a seamless and wonderful process, and the very best in terms of administration and support and logistics. So I just want to put that on the record. It's actually a particular honour for me to be able to moderate this session on migration, which is the first time that this topic has been put on the plenum agenda. An indication that migration, as we all know, is a key policy issue internationally, but it's also at the regional level and for many states around the world, including the Republic of Korea. It's also a strategic issue for all of us, and so I would like to compliment the foresight of Dr. Chung and the Asan Institute for including the topic of migration on this year's agenda. In terms of the format for this session, we have been asked to limit initial interventions to 5 minutes for all of the panel speakers, so that we can go to questions, take questions from the audience, particularly focusing on your interests that the panel members will be able to respond to. We've got a full panel with diverse disciplinary and thematic backgrounds, and we've also got a fairly wide coverage geographically, so all the hallmarks for a very rich discussion. Our first speaker on this complex topic of immigrants or refugees is Professor Mely, Caballero-Anthony from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, a long-term friend of Asan Institute, as I understand. We'll then hear from Professor Gordon Flake, who is the founding CEO of the Perth USA Center at the University of Western Australia. Next will be Ms. Jasmine Lee, who is the Executive Director of the Korean Cultural Diversity Foundation. Dr. Neil Ruiz, who is from the Global Migration Demography outfit at the Pew Research Center in the United States in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, Dr. Jae Sung, who's from the University of Melbourne and a specialist on migration and especially Korean migration. So we look forward to her insights. But before turning to the panel, I've been asked, especially because it is the first time that we've had migration on the agenda, to provide a few opening remarks in order to assist with our framing of the discussion, particularly in regards to the context of comments and discussion that we've heard over the last day and a bit, including in this morning's plenary session, but also in regards to the theme, which is the theme of careers choice. As has been highlighted, especially in the opening session yesterday by Dr. Hum, Korea has already made a series of choices historically that must guide, if not in large part determine current and future choices. We heard Dr. Hum talk about Korea's choice to build a market economy and develop democratic institutions in order to pursue peace and prosperity. And yet we also heard yesterday, and we read daily in social and traditional media, that the context in which Korea is required to make those choices has changed dramatically in recent years. Some of the key trends we're seeing now are likely to continue and to amplify in the future. And in a migration context, it's worth reflecting on 4 of those key global transformations. They will necessarily impact on how Korea chooses to respond to migration, as well as its near neighbours, as well as those further afield. Firstly, the first transformation is about the processes and products of globalisation. They're necessarily transforming how people connect. Information and communication technology advances are seeing migration processes change as people are able to connect in real time. They're able to access mobile money applications. They're able to access real-time information. They're able to benefit from dramatically reduced transportation costs and increased access. And this is making it easier for people to realise their migration aspirations. Second, we're seeing a breakdown of the former binary constructs of forced and voluntary migration. There's wide acknowledgement that a spectrum of self-agency exists these days throughout the migration cycle, and that people's degree of choice is very dynamic. It can shift very quickly. In practice, this means that even people with strong claims for international protection under the Refugee Convention are able to actively engage in migration, something that was not possible in the past. Third, we're seeing that while regulation of migration remains steadfastly at the national state level, we're seeing advances in global migration governance, such as the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees, finalised late last year. And we're also seeing changes at the city level increasingly. The former relates directly to UN member states recognising and taking action on the need to address migration more comprehensively at the international level. The latter is a direct result of the strong trend towards urbanisation globally, and that many international migrants gravitate towards cities, just as native-born populations do. The fourth and final global trend is that of demographic transformations. In brief, we're seeing advanced economies experience population decline, especially in North Asia and Eastern Europe. And we're seeing other parts of the world, most notably sub-Saharan Africa, with young populations, and they're likely to face increased difficulty, for some countries at least, to support employment and income generation strategies for future generations. So with this changing landscape in mind and a reflection on a few of the key trends affecting migration patterns and processes globally, I'd now like to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Caballero-Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introductory and framing of the issue that we have. But before I give my introductory remarks, once again, thank you to the Asan Institute for the invitation. I'm particularly delighted that we have, as the chair has mentioned, have this migration as one of the issues that we face, apart from looking at major power competition and what to do with issues about technology. Movements of people is really something that I think we have to pay attention to for one major reason, and that is that the notion of state security that we have always been talked about is no longer sufficient, and that when we talk about sustainable security or sustainable development, we now have to look at the security of people. And people on the move are the ones that faced one of the most dangerous, or one of the highest risk and new types of vulnerabilities. So given that as an introductory remark, let me just pick on some of the trends that has been introduced earlier on, and I want to make 3 points with regard to this topic. One is that the binary that we always talked about has now really changed into what they call the new dynamics or phases of migration. Once upon a time, we only think about migration as people moving for a specific purpose. But now why people move, and particularly how people move, has changed dramatically. So while we talked about labor migrants, we also need to talk about the other types of people on the move. And particularly as far as migration is concerned, or people's movement, most migration experts have underlined the fact that it's mostly now irregular migration that is taking a lot of, that is giving a lot of challenges to whether you're a receiving state or a sending state. And what are the different types of irregular migrations? It's not just the refugees, it's also those that have been trafficked, the traffic victims, those that are stateless, those that are as a result of either conflict or natural disasters. We now have displaced populations, internally displaced populations. And because of this, which brings me to my second point, and that is the traditional approaches that we have in dealing with migration is now put under severe pressure. And the responses that we have, whether it is in the conventions of the protection of migrant workers or the protection of refugees are increasingly becoming inadequate to respond and to address the insecurities faced by the different types of migrants, irregular migrants. And I use the word irregular, and most of you know this already, but the reason that the illegal is moved from, is replaced with the irregular is that when you look at it from the perspective of the people on the move, right? Those you want to help, that you want to protect. When you say illegal, it actually removes their own personal stories and the kind of vulnerabilities that they actually face. So increasingly, we're not just forced to look at or to respond to the needs of refugees, but in this whole gamut of forcibly displaced populations, how do you deal with the traffic victims, for example? And traffic victims, as I will come to later on, you have to disaggregate them. And in our part of the world, East Asia, right, this is a region where it is a transit point, it's also a destination, and it's an industry that yields about almost 150 billion a year. 34% of that is actually coming from, or actually earned from this part of the world. And if you look at the vulnerable populations that are trafficked, right, women, children, and increasingly men because of forced labor. And so the third point is, given that our current responses to deal with these different types of, I forgot to mention, how do you deal also with displaced population, forcibly displaced as a result of natural disasters? And in our part of the world, you talk about Southeast Asia, where I come from, in 2017 alone, we had about 3 million people displaced as a result of natural disasters, and coming from countries that are also, not in a better place economically, right? An Indonesian friend, you'd always want to joke with me when you talk about natural disasters in Southeast Asia, you name it, we have it. Whether it is earthquakes, tsunamis, severe typhoons. But what it says is that you increasingly have this huge population that are forced to move, and where do you place them? Right? How do you deal with them? So the last point is, at the international level, we talk about trying to deal with the challenges of migration. So you have, as the chair also mentioned, 2 very significant developments. The Global Compact on Migration, which calls for safe, orderly and regular migration, and the other one is the Global Compact on Refugees. While these are promising developments, increasingly it also poses a lot of questions. Number one is, to what extent can new global agreements, conventions actually be translated into regional and national actions? The commitment of states to this, commitment in terms of resources, in terms of, whether it's financial, whether it's in giving capacity, right? And among these very interesting 2 compacts, where are the gaps? And which part of the peoples on the move are actually not paid attention to? It's wonderful to know that the Global Compact on migration talks about people that are affected by climate change. But when you talk about labor migration, most of these arrangements only deal with skilled labor. But what happened to low-skilled labor? These are one of the things that I think has to be taught about. So these 3 things, in all, if you talk about new trends, the new phases of migration, inadequate responses, new initiatives, it brings to the fore the basic question about what kind of security do we really want to achieve. Unless we can ensure the security of our own people or peoples on the move, the state will always be insecure, the region will always be insecure, and it's about time, and this is already mentioned many times, either at the UN or the regional, our security is your security. Security has now gone beyond our own borders. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots of questions in my mind, and I've written down a few. A very interesting take in terms of security and human security aspects in regards to migration. You could tell that I've got my little timer on, so I don't need to wave a 5-minute mark because you'll hear the little timer go, the little buzzer going off. That's not me getting a text message, that's the timer in terms of 5-minute call. That works quite nicely. Let's use technology. What we'll do is we'll run through the panel, each speaker, and then we can open up for questions. So please, over to you, Professor Flake.
Well, thank you, Marie. And again, my thanks to the Asan Institute for their putting together the plenum, but also focusing on something that's not North Korea, US-RK alliance. So it's nice to be focusing on something different. Let me begin with a couple of caveats, kind of disclaimers, if you will. My mother is an immigrant. Strangely, since November 7th, 2016, I've tried to reclaim my Canadian identity. Things have changed a little bit. I look back, and 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants to the United States. My wife was a refugee from Laos. And so I personally benefited from that tremendous Indo-Chinese kind of refugee immigration trend in the 1970s and 80s that Paul Wolfowitz addressed in the previous panel. And then after 25 years in Washington, D.C., 5 years ago I defected to the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C. I'm feeling rather prophetic about that. But so I am an immigrant now, kind of making my way in a different country. And I would note that in addition to our illustrious chair and Richard McGregor, that an indication of Australia's relative openness is that of a very strong Australian delegation here to the Asan Plenum this year, there includes a Yank, a Finn, a Korean, and a Singaporean. So it gives you a sense of how immigration is transforming my new home in Australia. The final caveat I'll put out is that I'm not a real specialist on this issue, unlike Jay and the moderator and all the others on the panel, and yet these issues that we're discussing today, I find impact my work every single day. So I'm going to give a little bit more of a practitioner's perspective in terms of how it impacts me. And strangely enough, despite the fact that I've only been in Australia for 5.5 years, I'm going to look at this question through an Australia-Korea lens, through slices of that. Now, and on the surface, that may seem silly, because there's probably there are very few countries in the world that are as different as Australia and Korea when it comes to immigration. And yet, I think as you get to the end of this, you'll find out there's some commonalities that really are important in terms of how we discuss the issue. On the surface, if you look at several slices, South Korea now has a population of 51 million people. Australia last August barely hit 25 million people. And yet, in terms of population density, South Korea has 536 people per square kilometer. Australia has 3. Right? Just to give you a sense. So a very, very big difference in terms of the population writ large. If you look at immigration in terms of how it impacts society, in South Korea, I think there's only 1.4 million immigrants in the society, which is less than 3%. In Australia, there's over 7 million immigrants, which is greater than 30% of the society as a whole. So a very different impact on society and the nature of society as a whole. If you put that in a broader international context, obviously countries like the United States, with 47 million immigrants, or people born outside the country, to define more specifically, or Germany, have much larger populations, but as a percentage of the population, much smaller than, say, Australia. So the United States and Germany both have about 14% of the country which was born outside the country, where again, Australia is well over 30% in terms of that process. Now, the area where you'll find some closer similarities is a different slice, and that is to look like urbanization, right? If you look at rates of urbanization in Korea, about 81% of the population live in areas defined as urban areas. Yes. In Australia, that's 86%. So despite that big land and the relatively low rates of people per square kilometer, in terms of people's lived experience, Australia is actually more densely compact in that regard, in many respects, than Korea. They're more of an urban population. And the reason I mention that is because there are some real similarities in terms of how these countries have to deal with democracy and immigration. And that's the take I'd like to start with here. In January of this year, the Australian National University did their annual poll looking at public opinion towards immigration. And there's been a marked shift. In 2010, something like 46% of Australians, believed that Australia needed more people. As of January of this year, that had dropped down 15 points to 30%. So only 30% of the population felt that Australia needed more people. And there's similar results in terms of students coming into the country. So there's been, like in Korea, like in the United States, like in the EU, there has been a shift in terms of public opinion towards more populist views and greater skepticism towards the transit of peoples and immigration more broadly. The reason I mentioned the importance of that is in a democratic society that becomes important because that then impacts policy more directly. And to be very specific, my lived experience in Western Australia, where we have 2.5 million people in a state that's 50 times the size of South Korea, there's a screaming need for more people, not less people. And yet you cannot deny the lived experience of those urban populations in Melbourne and Sydney where they haven't invested in infrastructure and they're not ready for it. And so for a majority of the population, their lived experience says too many, and yet for a country as a whole, there is a screaming need for it. So the final point I make here, having recognized the bell ringing, my lived experience is that the answer between refugees and immigrants is obviously both, right? Because on the one hand, as a G20 nation, both South Korea and Australia have capacity and responsibility to deal, with the broader global trends and regional trends that others don't, right? And the second thing in terms of opportunity, both countries, as again, G20 nations, have the need for the human capital that kind of feeds into innovation in the economy. And I won't have time to go into in greater detail, but we can discuss it in the question and answer period. So.
Thank you indeed, Gordon. You've hit on a couple of very key points there, which I'm sure we'll discuss in quite some detail in the Q&A session. Now I'd like to pass to Ms. Jasmine Lee, who will give us a 5-minute or so intervention, and then we can take questions.
Okay. Let me try to time that one. I just would like to take this opportunity to thank Asan Institute. I have been here attending some of the sessions, but not actually speaking. This is my very first time to speak in an Asan Plenum, and just let me say this. I wish I had this panel of speakers when I was a member of the Assembly. I could have done more, as I would say, but my term ended in 2016. I was quite a big, Gordon was actually talking about it earlier. I have been studying about you the entire time. And speaking about me and following what happened to me here in Korea. But actually, during that time, I think, and as he has said, there's a shift. There's been a shift to, everyone was asking me the same question, actually. What happened within the past 4 years? Why the shift? But I think it's not necessarily only in Korea, but it's the entire world that is experiencing this particular shift. So way back in 2012, one of the main issues in Korea is multiculturalism, because the number of children going or attending school here in Korea, multicultural kids attending school in Korea is actually increasing. So I think it became the focus of the government during that particular time, and then after 4 years, the issue shifted to unemployment. Thus, the reason that it became, sort of moved or shifted to in the sidelines. So I think the reason I'm here is particularly that, looking at the panel description on the book, the last question actually says that, is South Korea socially prepared to embrace multiculturalism? I wish I could answer that, but there's one particular answer that I can give everyone right now. There was the MOJEF, or the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, last Thursday released I think the results of the survey that was made from April of 2018 to March of 2019, and the results are actually quite. I don't know if I could say it's better or not, because we have more younger students. It means there are more younger students who are accepting of multiculturalism. That would mean from 2015, we have like 52.8% of of people who are accepting of multiculturalism. This is talking about students, but this year it increased to 71.22%. So it's it's quite a jump from that. But I think it's also the same with adults. Back in 2015, it's 53.96% about accepting multiculturalism, and this year it's 67.63%. So they're doing this every 3 years. Now, the ratio of people mingling. Are you okay to mingle with foreigners or with immigrants? Well, we have the students saying it's 78.49%, okay for them. So, and the adults is 42.48, which is quite lower than the way it used to be in 2015. It kind of decreased. And also the relationships that we can show. For students, it actually increased, the amount of relationship and the amount of, even friendships or having families or having immigrants working with them. It kind of increased to 41.2%, whereas 41% from 34.7%, and it decreased in the adults. So they have less communication or less family or less friends or less people to work with that are immigrants or foreigners. So what will that mean? I mean, that would actually mean with the students part, because we have had lesser students, we have younger multicultural kids way back then, and now they're going to school. They're starting to go to school, and that's one of the reasons that students will have more opportunity to meet multicultural kids or kids born out of international marriages. Now, that actually is the only answer that Korea can actually give you when it comes to the question that if Korea is socially prepared to accept multiculturalism. Now, when I used to be a member of the Assembly, I used to write bills, and automatically ministries will call to me. I mean, what projects do we have to do to be able to pursue this particular bill? I mean, my job is making a bill, and the project making process is supposed to be your job as a ministry, but they didn't know how to do that, especially when I was talking about how to increase the positive perspective of the people when it comes to immigrants. And also, there was one particular thing that I just would like to mention before we move on. When I tried to write a bill, as a mandatory bill, to increase education regarding multiculturalism to students and teachers, the question way back in the Assembly, that's why it did not, the reason that it didn't pass was, well, we have not decided if we're going multicultural yet, so how can we do this? How can we make this mandatory? So that particular question was back in 2014, and we're 5 years off now, so it's kind of, maybe it's different now, maybe it's not, but definitely is changing.
Thank you very much indeed, Jasmine. We've already had some, I've been scrambling down the stats, very interesting statistics so far on the panel, and we now have someone who will give us more statistics. Dr. Ruiz has left some materials on your chairs. It's quite a substantial presentation, a wonderful presentation. I had the opportunity to go through that last night. There's a lot of rich material. We do have 5 minutes, but please peruse the material, and if you've got questions, we can cover those in the Q&A session. So please, over to you, Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for having me. So Pew Research Center, you have a lot of statistics there, but I'll just highlight a few in the next 5 minutes. We are nonpartisan, non-advocacy, so because of our public opinion research, we don't make any policy recommendations. So that's a disclaimer I have to give. But when we did the survey around the world last spring, we asked a question about, do immigrants today make our country stronger because of their work and talents? Mm-hmm. Or do immigrants today are a burden on your country because they take our jobs and social benefits? Around the world, majority believe that immigrants are a strength or to their countries, with a few exceptions, countries, especially in Europe, that actually experienced the 2015 refugee crisis. That was a very big shock, and you see countries like Greece, Hungary, Italy, that have large majorities that do not believe they're more of a burden. We also asked this question, in your opinion, should we allow more immigrants to move to our country, fewer immigrants, or about the same as we do now? And around the world, most want fewer immigrants, especially in Europe, but with some exceptions. There's some interesting caveats here in the region. You see that South Korea and about 28% wants fewer immigrants, but actually the majority, like Japan, want about the same level. I know that you have a very small level of immigration to South Korea, but people here, the public, only want the same level that you do now. but this is also very different in other parts of the world. In the United States, where I come from, extremely divided. And when you do divide the data by whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning, you see very different views. And this is also the same in Europe. When you turn to integration, asking the public, do immigrants today want to adopt your customs and way of life, or want to be distinct from our society? And around the world, it's quite mixed. Japan, your neighboring country, it's quite fascinating. 75% of them believe that they want to adopt their ways of life. But that's also because Japan has a very small population of immigrants. So it's telling us something about how people integrate, especially here in Asia, that people are more positive on that. When it comes to high-skilled immigration, around the world, we have a competition for the best and brightest. Around the world, people are okay with having high-skilled immigrants. Even among those who want fewer immigrants, high-skilled immigration seems to be a non-political issue. And then, taking a flip side, looking at out-migration, thinking about brain drain, people leaving your countries. We asked this question around the world, is it a problem that people are leaving your country for jobs abroad? Is it a very big problem or moderately big problem? And here in South Korea, like the rest of the world, majority believe it's a big problem. You see that very similar to Japan, and you see other countries in Europe as well, where you have supermajorities that believe out-migration is a big problem. This is less of an issue for US, for the big destination countries. I think they're okay with Americans. They're okay with them leaving to Australia, so it's okay that you're left. But so we asked this next question about intentions to migrate. In the next 5 years, do you intend to leave your country? And we saw here in South Korea, about 6% of Republic are planning to leave in the next 5 years. This is still much smaller than parts of sub-Saharan Africa. To give you an example, Nigeria, 45% of the public plan to move in the next 5 years. And this brings to me this question about people leaving as well as out-migration. And I want to give you a little bit of overview about South Koreans who are in the United States. South Koreans are the third biggest population of foreign students studying at US universities. And you have about 6% of all foreign students studying in the United States who are working in the US are from South Korea. This is quite large. And what's interesting is that this is a big question for South Korea, like what do you do when you have a large population studying in the US? Is it okay for them to stay in the US, or do you want them back here? Well, here's the demographics of South Koreans who are staying in the United States. Most have studied at City University of New York, NYU, and the Fashion Institute of Technology. The majors of South Koreans who are in the United States working are mostly in the business, management, as well as visual and performing arts majors, which is actually very interesting. I don't know, and also engineering is the third most popular major among South Koreans staying and working in the United States. And the metropolitan areas where they're staying is New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, which makes sense, which are big cities, or Silicon Valley. And let me end here with, so that's a little flavor. That's a big question for the panel and also for the audience. The question is like, what do you do when you have this population also who are living outside, and the question of trying to bring here the issue about brain drain and brain gain. And lastly, I'll end with refugees. We asked this question about talking about immigration. Would you be supportive or oppose taking in refugees from countries where people are fleeing violence and war? Around the world, even in countries that did experience the 2015 refugee surge, still support that. Maybe it's the way we pose the question because they're seeing that they're fleeing violence and war, but pretty much the majority, with exceptions in Israel as well as Russia and South Africa, but the majority around the world believe in taking refugees. And just to end here, just talking about UNHCR data, around the world, this refugee crisis is a big problem. The refugees worldwide has increased. We're at a historic high, but also those being resettled were also at a historic low. And this has a lot to do with the United States, which has been a leader in resettling refugees around the world. Historically, in one of the graphs there, they have been the most in terms of resettling compared to other countries around the world. But most recently, since the Trump administration has taken power, the United States is now resettling less refugees than the rest of the world. So that's a historic change. So I will end there, but I think there's a lot of statistics on your in the PowerPoint that I gave to you, but I'll leave you with that so we can have a great conversation.
Thank you
for
very much
having me.
indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Ruiz. That's a lot of stats in there, but you've drawn out some very salient ones that certainly we'll come back to in the Q&A. I'd now like to pass over to Dr. Jae-song, who will give us her 5-minute intervention, and I can imagine what it's going to be on. We've worked for a number of years together.
I'll do
Over to
my
you, Jae.
best. Thank you so much, Mary. And my thanks goes to Asan Institute for inviting me for this very prestigious plenum. It's my first time here to Asan, but I'll do my best to sort of wrap up everything in 5 minutes. It's a big topic, as you say, migration and refugee issues in relation to the Korea's development. I'm so glad, as many panelists share the same view, that migration is included in one of the agenda in the Asan Forum. I'm looking at the panelists. Neil, are you a migrant?
Yes, my parents are from the Philippines, but they migrated.
Right, so I'm just looking at all the panelists. We are 100%, we are all migrants. You probably ask your family members, who are migrants, who are native. A country's migration history tells something about the country's economic and social development. If you look at the Korea's case, especially after the Second World War, Korean migrants started as refugees from the Korean War, and they became labor migrants to Saudi Arabia, nurses and miners to Germany during the 1970s, and after the globalization, South Korean migrants have particularly South Korean skilled migrants all over the world. So you can see the evolution of Korean migrants becoming from refugees and forced migrants to become labor migrants and then skilled migrants in more developed countries in the US, Europe, and Australia, where I'm based. But that's the history of immigrants, who are people who are leaving Korea at the outbound migration. But when you look at the inbound migration, about the immigrants in South Korea, I was looking at some figures, slightly different from Gordon's figure. I was looking at the 2017, the latest figure of foreign residents in South Korea. There are about 2.2 million. If you calculate it in terms of the whole of South Korean population, that's only 4.6%. So it's very, very, very small. If you calculate the other way around, it means that 96% of the population living in South Korea are South Korean citizens. So we have a very small number of Korean residents who include labor migrants from South and Southeast Asia, and marriage migrants from China, Southeast Asia, and international students basically from all over the world. So that's only constituting 4.6%. So that's why many people consider South Korea as a very homogeneous society. So yeah, large percentage of South Korean population are ethnic Koreans. And there is a question about the refugees, especially after the adoption of 2013 Refugee Act in South Korea. There has been increasing number of asylum applicants lodged their application to Ministry of Justice. The number has increased from just about 1,500 in 2013, and last year's figure grew almost like 10,000. So it was 9,900 application lodged at the ministry. But if you look at the acceptance level, the success rate is 0.1. So it was 121, 121 people who are accepted as refugees. They got their settlement in South Korea. And that's embarrassingly a small number compared to the application. 0.1% success rate, which means 99% are failure. And it's a similar situation in Japan, but Japan's justification is that there are other ways of contributing to the refugee regime internationally. They do make a lot of donation to the refugee regime so that they can give protection elsewhere outside Japan. So that's something we need to think about when it comes to foreign residents who are mostly labor migrants and marriage migrants. And when you look at the refugee who really need the international protection, immediate protection, South Korea's record is not something that should be proud of. But South Korea has a reason for that small number of refugees. South Korea has been accepting and accommodating, settling North Korean refugees for the past 70 years after the end of the Korean War. So there is that justification. They're not refugees under South Korean constitution, because constitution defines territorial boundary as the entire Korean peninsula, not just the southern half of the peninsula. So when North Koreans arrive in South Korea, they become South Korean citizens. So there is a justification that we need to tackle, we need to deal with, we need to accommodate and protect North Korean refugees first and foremost important priority for settling refugees. Then we can look at non-ethnic Korean population who needs protection in the Republic of Korea. So North Korean defectors in South Korea, the latest number is around 32,000, but it's also very small. If you think of the 51 million South Korean population, it's very small. Number has been fluctuated since 2012. The number has decreased a bit. There are various factors. There may be some border control became more stronger after Kim Jong-un took power. There are also a less number of people who want to leave North Korea. I've been interviewing roughly around 500 North Korean refugees living in South Korea and in China, and also Europe and Australia. But they are telling me that these North Koreans living in South Korea are struggling to survive. They don't have the competitive skills, like they don't speak good English, they can't use computers, and it's just difficult to catch up with this capitalist system in South Korea. So there are some small number of North Koreans who are actually going back to North Korea, saying that it's better to be equally poor rather than surviving in South Korean country, in which you see a growing gap, income gap between the poor and the rich. Obviously, North Koreans are falling into not those the top rich, but they're struggling sort of. The North Korean refugees I've been interviewing, they've been telling me that they don't like the second-class citizen treatment from the fellow South Koreans. So that has been the South Koreans' justification not to accept refugees from around the world. The number one population who got refugee status determination in South Korea are from Myanmar and Bangladesh, and they are Karen people, and also some of the Rohingya people, or a very small number of Rohingya people are granted refugee status in South Korea. We can start there. I think having refugees and other ethnic minorities as laborers or marriage migrants is good for South Korea in terms of ethnic and cultural and even political diversity. But as Jasmine said, whether South Korea is preparing, being ready with more accommodating multicultural policies, that's the area that all policymakers are looking into. So yeah. My sort of brief conclusion is that yes, South Koreans should and can accept more refugees who need international protection to share its international responsibility to protect refugees worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jay. What I might do now is I've got questions for all of the panel members. I would propose to ask one question with a brief response, and then we can open it up for discussion, because we've had such very interesting takes on subtopics, as I would call it, within the migration context. So if we can proceed on that basis, then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So first, in terms of moving to Dr. Caballero-Anthony, to Mely, you gave us really interesting insights on the security dynamics in regards to migration, not just national security, regional security, but also human security. And my question is really in regards to governance issues, and how can states combat irregular migration, which you spoke about, without undermining human rights and or contravening their international obligations in regards to human rights and conventions that they may be signatories to?
I speak from the region that I know most. When you talk about regular migration, labor migration, we have in the region regional agreements. We have a declaration of the protection of migrant workers, particularly women. We also have this Convention on Trafficking in Persons. From the receiving country, how do you actually ensure human security of these migrants, labor migrants, and even irregular migrants? There are expectations that you would at least ensure that they are protected and provided with basic needs. I talk about access to healthcare, which is very important. Access to, if it's a regular migration, access to, some kind of legal help. So that they have protection and they are not, especially if they're traffic victims, and because most of them are afraid to report because they'll be deported or they punish the law. So there are regulations within countries that try, to follow this regional frameworks, if you like, which is actually not different from international frameworks. It must be said, however, that problems persist, particularly in the region where there's a lot of. We talk about labor migration. In Southeast Asia, we are generally, most countries in the region are sending countries, but Southeast Asian countries also are receiving countries. So without having to name names, there are countries that are very careful about how they treat and provide for the protection of their domestic helpers, or generally these are labor protectors. And it's embedded in their laws and regulations. And if you're an employer and you fail to follow, right, and you're reported to actually abuse the rights of your worker, then there are penalties for it. And there have been cases where it's employers have actually been the gray area, and that's where I want to emphasize is it's in how we deal with the human security of these irregular migrants. At one point you can be living as a regular, when you leave your country, you can be considered a legal migrant, a regular migrant. But along the process, because you are, especially if you're a low-skilled worker, you don't actually know what's happening, you're actually, exposed to the exploitation of agents, then you become suddenly an irregular migrant. And this is where I think there has to be more efforts taken, so legal protection and protection of, and provision of basic needs. Because if you don't address these issues, an argument has been made that they could actually become security problems as well. And it's not just in Southeast Asia, but in other countries, they're basically stigmatized, or they're also labeled, or they're also profiled. High incidence of, petty crimes or violence are blamed on your migration, your migrants. And the reason why some of them are perhaps for unintentional or intentionally is because they are deprived of basic needs. It's not an excuse for them to commit the crime, etc. So you would hope that countries will have these regulations in place, and as I said, in the region that I come from, there are these arrangements, but it is also the responsibility of countries that are sending to ensure that their labor migrants are familiar with the law, and this is where education, and you talk about the biggest center of migrant workers in Southeast Asia is the Philippines, where the process of sending out is regulated, and workers or migrants are informed about the kind of protection that they're expected, and at the same time they are informed about the laws of the country that are receiving them. I think that is very critical, right? But when you talk about the other side of the irregular migrants, the refugees, we have a very big problem in Southeast Asia. I mean, I think the refugee problem is the UNHCR in Southeast Asia alone. We have about over 1 million, and 670 of that are actually refugees from Myanmar, the Rohingya refugees. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia, we have not really done very well in trying to do something about them. Most of them are actually housed in a neighboring, the closest state, which is Bangladesh. Nevertheless, what countries can do to provide for, if they are not open to refugees, is ensuring that they participate in providing assistance. Right? On very few cases, there are reports of countries, for example, if they are boat people, they come to the shores, then they're provided immediate assistance. And that is, in a way, assistance is in a way also protecting them. But looking at it in the longer term, there are no programs about integrating, well, housing them, integrating them. That's this a long haul ball game, new thing altogether. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Mely. That's a very good oversight on Southeast Asian migration in a nutshell. I would add too that protection infrastructure within Southeast Asia is very much lacking. And we have seen in the past, as Mely's quite rightly pointed out, we've seen assistance provided to displaced populations. But we have also seen in May 2015, most notably, where countries did not provide the assistance that they would normally have provided, and they engaged in what is called help-on policies, which is to provide some supplies to people caught and stranded on boats and then pushed back out into sea. And it resulted in the crisis in the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea of Bengalis and Rohingya at that time. Of course, there have been a lot of changes and developments at the international level, at the national level, including anti-trafficking prosecutions in Thailand and other countries. So hopefully, if we see that type of situation arise again, the region will be much better placed, indeed. Now, moving on to Gordon, I found your discussion really interesting, and the stats that you provided were quite illuminating, particularly in regards to the public opinion survey and the change in public sentiment. There's a lot of research on the links between, quite rightly, it's an important area, the links between voices in the media, traditional and social media, and what is reflected in public opinion. It's a very difficult area because causality is impossible, as we know. But some of the research has found that the most dominant voices are those, and this is internationally, destination, origin country, as well as transit country, have found that the most dominant voices in the media tend to be politicians. So my question to you is, what advice would you provide to leaders, political leaders, as well as leaders of industry, business leaders? And you pointed to quite rightly that paradox in terms of public sentiment, but the need for workers. What advice would you provide to them in trying to reconcile those issues and change the narrative, which is one that is much more fact-based within their particular communities?
Well, thank you. There's no question that leadership matters on this, and it makes a big impact. The day after the election in the United States over 2 years ago, I was doing an interview on public radio in Australia, and I got a call from a caller who gave his name, his neighborhood, and then made a joke saying, "I'd like to invite you to my home this evening. We're having a Make Australia Great Again party." I laughed, he laughed, and then he proceeded to go on this racist rant about how the Saxons were on the march and white power would come again. And here I am sitting in the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington. And the way in which President Trump campaigned, was elected, and for the last 2.5 years has governed, impacted there. So in other words, there's no place in the world that is not safe from the impact of these types of sentiments. And when they're expressed on a very public level and very frequently, it then has echoes through almost every society on earth. So we're in a very difficult spot. There's no question about it. One of the most influential op-eds I've read in the last year was written by David Brooks, who's kind of the Democrats' favorite Republican in the New York Times. He wrote an op-ed last June that very few people paid attention to, but it's really important. The title was, June 17th in 2018, the title was, "Trump is not playing by your rules." And so I thought it was just a domestic thing. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. But when you read it, his basic argument was this: the fundamental divide of our era is not East-West, China-US, North-South, capitalist-communist. It's high trust versus low trust. And he basically said, if you look at it, multilateralism, alliances, international laws, standards, norms, organizations, they're hard. They require cooperation. They require expertise, finesse to management. Everything that Mely just talked about is a hard thing, right? The laws and the process. You know, and there's a certain group of people who cannot thrive in high-trust societies. What they want is they want chaos. They want fear, right? Because in fear, you know, you're thugs, right? If you're wolves, you know, you can't thrive in a high-trust society. What you want is a low-trust society where everybody is clamoring for a strong man. And so to be very blunt, he listed specifically Trump and Duterte and Putin and Erdogan and others as wolves who were doing everything they could to tear down standards, institutions, norms, and laws in a way to do it. And interesting enough, you're going to be hard-pressed to find an issue, immigration included, that doesn't fall into that broad rubric, right? And so one of the hard things is, how do we then combat, you know, those types of sentiments? And I'll give you a couple of other examples where leadership matters. You know, what is the international reputation of New Zealand today? Jacinda Ardern and the way she responded to the horrific bombings in a mosque, or the events in a mosque, it has really fundamentally changed the world, the way the world views, New Zealand. Unfortunately, for the country where I live now in Australia, despite the fact that 49% of Australians, I think probably this year or next we'll have the tipping point, were either first or second generation migrants. You know, the international media all focused on a fringe senator who wrote a horrible letter, and that became the face of Australia. In a similar way, Australia had some difficulties in that, on the one hand, despite being one of the most open countries to migration in the world, a very strict irregular migration stop the boats policy has had some reputational implications in the process. I would also throw out Justin Trudeau, whatever you think of his politics or policies in terms of the image. So one of the feelings I had sitting in Western Australia in a state where we desperately need more people, and I would argue Australia's #1 challenge as a nation is human capital. You know, a country with global ambitions, global reach, G20, and yet a population of North Korea, population of Taiwan. You know, and so one of the real challenges is, how do you then continue to reach out to get the best and the brightest to want to come? And my feeling was, post-Brexit, post-Trump, you know, all Australia had to do was be quiet, and the best and the brightest would be banging down our doors. And unfortunately, we weren't, right? And the beneficiary has been New Zealand and Canada, which is it really sucks for Canada to be so cool these days, right? And New Zealand even more in terms of that process. And let me just say one final thing, because it goes back to our host country here today, Korea. Individuals matter, leadership matters. Korean history, in some respects, was changed for the better by Heinz Ward, and more specifically, Heinz Ward's mother. For those of you who don't know who Heinz Ward is, he's a half-black, half-Korean U.S. professional football player who won the Most Valuable Player award in the 2006 Super Bowl, right? And all of a sudden, every Korean said, wow, he's Korean, and they just loved him. But what they didn't account for was Heinz Ward's mom. And his mom was this kind of just pithy old Korean grandma who came here and went on a tour of Korea with his mother, and every day for a month, in every interview says, you're racist, you called my boy half-blood, you spit on him, and now you just like him because he's a Super Bowl MVP. And the Korean polity as a whole just kind of went, oh, my goodness, you're right, we're racist, right? And that led to this real swell, you know, and Koreans can do this more than any other country I know because of that multicultural push, right? Yes. We must be multicultural, right? And again, there's some tremendous evidences of that swing in 2006, 2007. Unfortunately, however, we're now facing a countervailing wave. And it's a countervailing wave in which leadership, be it media, political, or popular figures, is more important than ever before.
Thank you indeed. Gordon, there's lots that we could go into there, including as an Australian, but we'll move on to Jasmine. And it was a very nice segue actually into Jasmine's presentation and some really interesting statistics that you provided to us. What I was interested in finding and exploring a little bit more about, and you gave us a really good sort of demographic breakdown and looked at students who are much more likely to be younger and the differences. Did you find any differences in regards to geography? We were talking earlier about urbanisation, and if you can take us through some of those breakdowns, that would be useful, just in a general sense.
Well, if we think about, as you have said, most are, if we're talking about multicultural families or foreigners here in Korea, most are very much concentrated also in the urban areas, in the metropolitan areas. And a lot of people actually think that a lot of, especially marriage migrants, will be married to people in the provinces, in the rural areas.
Yep.
But then the thing is, because there are lesser people in the provinces, they seem to see, by ratio, they can feel that there are a lot more foreigners or a lot more immigrants in the rural areas. But that's because that's how you see it in ratio. But according to the numbers, we have more people living in the Gyeonggi area, in the Seoul area, in the urban areas, because that's where a lot of or more opportunity to work exists. As you probably know, we have more from Southeast Asia. Most of the marriage migrants are Southeast Asians. And as of now, we have, I think, Vietnam. We used to have a lot more people coming from China, but now we have more people coming from Vietnam getting married. The numbers are going down, but it's still increasing. Now, it's not, I think we peaked at about 11% of the marriages being multicultural, international marriages, but now it's a lot more lower than that. And I think the most, and children too, the differences right now, children, we have more of them concentrated also in the urban areas where schools, or the opportunity to go to schools are there. And of course, there are a lot more schools to go to, I would think so, that especially for those children which we call the invisible children. These are the children born out of undocumented, irregular or undocumented, it doesn't matter what word you actually use, undocumented immigrants here in Korea. So these kids, we don't have any processes to have them registered. So we actually have just a very rough estimate from NGOs that we have about 30,000 of these kids. Wow. And then sadly, by law, it's not mandatory to give kids education here in Korea, regardless of their status, their visa status. So a lot of these children, it actually is not mandatory. So it's actually the principal's decision if they're going to accept a kid to school who doesn't have any papers. So it's undocumented or invisible, as what we call them here in Korea. So the probability of them coming over to the urban areas is high because there's a lot more school nearby where they can choose if they get turned down by one particular school. So it still goes with the fact that it's only not by law, but kind of policy of the Ministry of Education that you cannot. You cannot discriminate when it comes to education, but still it comes to the decision of the principal. Thus, if the principal thinks that they won't be accepting this particular kid or this might be a problem to the school overall, and as we have said, the rising negativity when it comes to multiculturalism, also parents from schools actually are trying to avoid having more multicultural kids. We have one school here in Asan City, which is actually a 100-year-old. It's a 100-year-old school, but now I think it's about 60 or 70% multicultural, and most of the Korean students have left the particular school because they think there are too many multicultural kids in the said school. So this might happen in a lot more schools here in Korea because we still have 60% of the children not attending at an age that is not yet attending school. So when they actually reach the age of going to school, it's going to be a lot more different for all of them.
And this is where scalability in regards to policy responses becomes particularly
indeed.
important. But my memory might be fading because I did live in Korea about 10 years ago for a number of years. But I understood that Korea was a signatory to the Convention of the Rights of the Child.
I'm sorry?
A signatory to the Convention of the Rights of the Child.
Yes, indeed.
So we then have a paradox here in regards to the inability to access education, which is a fundamental issue for children and the rights of children. and a kind of like a policy vacuum, as you talked about, this sort of grey area.
I actually wrote a bill about that before I finished my stint at the Assembly, and it became so popular because people are thinking that that particular bill allowing all children below 18 years old to receive all of the basic needs that that we have to provide. Korea has to provide the four basic, the needs, basic human needs of all of these children: education, health, and all of that. It became so negative because a lot of people. On the database of the Assembly, it's the most commented bill ever in the history of Korea, with 15,000 comments saying this is going to populate us with illegal aliens. So everyone, most of those 15,000 comments say no to that particular bill. And all of that particular bill, we actually followed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as we wrote that particular bill. And where we got the most negativity is the part where the kid has the right to live with his parents. So the kid having the right to live with his parents, meaning if the parents is also undocumented, then that would mean they're probably going to have kids here in Korea. All undocumented people will have kids here in Korea. It's kind of like very negative, very, very textbookish. I mean, it's, I don't know, it's very basic as what Gordon has said, scare or fear of immigration, of immigration and immigrants that's being shown. But I really would have hoped someone would actually take it from the Assembly after that, because it really kind of took off. It was it became popular, but a lot of people now are actually thinking that we should have done it, that we needed it. It's just that we need someone to actually push it through again. So we're actually waiting, we're actually trying to do that. We have 30 organizations trying to talk to a particular member of the Assembly to actually push having that particular bill back.
Well,
in the
hopefully
Assembly.
this time next year we'll be able to get an update on that particular complex but urgent, I would say, policy issue. Thank you very much indeed. Now over to you, Neil. I had several questions in mind, but one that came up really and comes up consistently and constantly in migration circles is really the limitations, and if you can share your perspectives on the limitations and the benefits in regards to conducting, and we're talking about technical but also from a policy perspective, intention surveys and the robustness and the rigour around those, and the fact that they can be used to incite fear when a lot of the academic research is very clear. You may have preferences to migrate internationally and or to a particular country, but realising those preferences most people don't do. So if you could take us through some of the key issues there, that would be good.
Okay, that's a great question. And first, before I get to that question, just to get to your question with Gordon on leadership, 2 weeks ago we released a race survey. It was a very big survey from Pew Research Center on race relations in the United States. And we had a question that we asked during Obama's year versus Trump. Did race relations? Did Trump or Obama make race relations worse, better off, or about the same? And large majority of the United States believe that Trump has made race relations worse, 56%, versus when Obama it was only 25%. But this is also split by race. So whites, not the majority. 49% only believe Trump has made race relations worse, whereas English-speaking Asians, blacks, and Hispanics, supermajority, believe that Trump has made race relations worse. So that's just to that leadership question. But in terms of limitations on intentions to migrate, that's a great question. I mean, Gallup has been doing that for a while, and you're right, it could instill fear. I didn't present that part because I didn't have enough time, but we did ask a set of 3 more questions. How serious someone is to actually migrate. So we asked, did they actually gather documents? Did they actually save and borrow money? Did they actually apply for the necessary visas? And when you do that, sorry I didn't have time to present that, it actually filters down even more. So Nigeria, even though you said 45% intend to migrate in the next 5 years, it actually drops significantly to less than a quarter. But Tunisia, on the other hand, goes up, is more serious, and it probably has a lot to do with the political issues going there. So, but you're right, that's a good question. Our intentions are not to instill fear, but trying to understand if people are really planning to go. But we do ask deeper questions than just the one question.
Great, and also longitudinal data. I'm sure you collect that over time to look at different changes.
So we can see changes of trends, yes.
Yes,
Yep.
very good. Thank you so much indeed. I think that's a point that's worth making, particularly in regards to intention surveys. Jay, I have a question that's been running for more than a decade in my mind, and you raised it and you spoke about it, and at the plenary this morning, Paul Wolfowitz actually mentioned it. He said it very, very starkly. But I think it's worthwhile exploring the issue of defectors / refugees from DPRK. You know, when I arrived in Korea more than a decade ago to spend a few years here, I was surprised at the issues around asylum seeking and refugees, Korea being a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but not a resettlement country, and having very low processing. You talked about the finally determined grant rates, which are extraordinarily low. But then on the other hand, I got to learn that in fact we've got large numbers who are coming through from DPRK. You talked about a change in that sort of trend. Is there really a case to be made, as Paul Wolfowitz mentioned this morning, for defectors to really be considered by the international community as refugees? You know, it's very clear they are in international, in need of international protection. Non-refoulement is a clear case for non-refoulement issues to be in play. But do you think that harms and hinders other discussions, such as the Yemenis arriving on Jeju in the last couple of years, and the issues that have arisen there? I think it would be really worthwhile exploring those sorts of issues in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, North Koreans fall under, refugee definition under international law, but because North and South Korea have a special relations, they see the other party, the peoples under the other party, as part of their people. So it's under the constitution, and North Korea also defines a territorial definition, the whole of Korean peninsula as well. So if South Koreans arrive in North Korea, they will become North Korean citizens. And also the term defector itself is quite derogatory. Defect means you are leaving something that has a defection, that has faults in the system. So it has a very political connotation attached to it. That's why North Koreans, when they arrive in South Korea, they have this sort of, discriminatory treatment by their fellow South Koreans, because they are the ones who are escaping from the defected system. So they're lacking something inherently in their human nature, or even their capacity to survive in a highly capitalist, competitive society. But if we South Koreans want to recognize North Korea as refugees, the two states have to be separate, states. It has to be two separate states. Under the UN, it is a separate member state since 1991. But because of the special relation, it's a divided country. End of the Korean War was not with a peace treaty, but with ceasefire. So technically, the two Koreas are at war. The war can be resumed at any time. So until that peace resolution, the peace structure is established, either become one country or totally two separate state under international law and the UN. I think accepting them as refugees, treating them as a separate population who need international protection, it would be difficult. I forgot to mention South Korea's immigration policy is highly ethnocentric. It's a very focus on the ethnocentric calculation about who Koreans are, who are not. Among these 2.2 million foreign residents, 47% are from the People's Republic of Korea, China, and a large number of them are actually ethnic Korean Chinese national. So it's based on that sort of, highly, the ethnocentric calculation, who to accept and who to recognize as Koreans or not, who are foreigner, who are one of us. That's in their calculation for a long time. Gordon talked about the Korean racism, and Jasmine talked about the multiculturalism. I think there is a big tension between these two. I had a friend who's a Muslim from Indonesia. I took her to a Korean restaurant, and it was a bibimbap specialty place. And I told the middle-aged woman, Ajumma, that my friend is Muslim, so she doesn't eat pork, and no meat at all in the bibimbap. And she said, okay, I understand. Then when the food arrived, bibimbap arrived, the meat, the pork was hiding underneath the bibimbap. And the Ajumma's rationale is that bibimbap without pork is not delicious, and she should eat these pork-based bibimbap. So that's sort of based on the lack of understanding about the other cultures and other religions. And I also visited one of those multicultural centers. That was a long time ago, 2009 and 10. And I felt like it was not really educating the multicultural, customs in different cultures and practices. I felt more like it's an assimilation center. So they're teaching these non-Korean marriage migrants how to cook kimchi, how to speak Korean. So it was more like how to assimilate, how to integrate these non-Korean into this Korean custom. I'm sure that's changed a lot these days. I see more sort of multicultural events. No, I see a lot of shaking heads here. So that's the Korean racism, the lack of understanding about the other cultures, and that's not based on ethnicity. I don't think Koreans have a genuine understanding about the different ethnicity. I think it's more based on the skin color, whether dark or pale. So the whole idea about Korean moving toward a more multicultural society must start from school, the public education about other cultures, and where to put this North Korean, still majority of the South Korean population see them as one of them because they're ethnically Korean, but they're from different system, and whether to put them under this refugee under international law or not, I think is something that South Korean should decide pretty soon.
I just would want to add something about the North Korean and the multicultural families, because there's also a glitch in that particular relationship between the two. Now, I once, when I was in the assembly, I thought because I worked with the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, as well as the Ministry, as well as the Gender Equality and Family Committee. Now, the Gender Equality and Family Ministry is the one who oversees all of the multicultural policies, whereas the Unification Ministry is the one that oversees all of the policies when it comes to the North Korean defectors. Now, I was looking at both the processes and the policies that's going between the two, and they really look very, very similar. They have very, very similar structure, and I once said, why don't we just actually mix this particular, these two group, because there has been a North Korean defector who's been talking to me who was saying that multicultural families are actually receiving more support than North Korean defectors when it comes to policies, having multicultural centers all around to go to learn to, or being offered a lot more subsidies of some sorts. They actually think about that. So I said, so maybe we could actually just put them into one category. Will that work for you? And I had an interview regarding that, and I actually said that to the press, and it came out. And there was a lot of comments, there was a lot of phone calls that came that we're not foreigners from North Korean defectors. We are Koreans, we're not foreigners. You're going to put us in the same bowl. So it's kind of like going to be difficult with that particular part too.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed for adding that, Jasmine. Now I'd like to open it up to the floor. We've got around about 10 minutes left, and I can see a few hands. I'll take a few questions all together, and then we can get the panel to respond. So I've got yourself, a person at the back, Neil, is that? And someone at the front. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This panel, it's a welcome addition to this plenum, I think, and you are all able to introduce the appropriate breadth and depth to this issue. So I appreciate all of your contributions. My name is Darcy Drow. I'm a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins, and I'm in Seoul for the next several months researching Korea's immigration policy reform. So this was a particularly interesting panel for me. My question is mostly directed at Jasmine, Lee, and Jae Song. And I'd like to readopt a concept that Dr. McAuliffe had introduced, how the binary construct of migration is being called into question. And I think that that's particularly apt in the case of Korea, in particularly this question of multiculturalism, because now we're seeing it, the rise and maybe fall of this question of damunwa in Korea, how the state and society both are seeing it. And so I wonder, Jasmine Lee, you brought up these differences in how youth and mainstream society see multiculturalism, but in my interviews here, I wonder, how do people see multiculturalism? Is it a question of assimilation? Or is there a deeper understanding of cultural communication in Korea? And how are you concerned about how multiculturalism is being portrayed in both policies and in these multicultural centers like in Asan and the smaller cities? Do you feel like that's part of this negative feelings, perhaps backlash in certain pockets in South Korea? And then the second question for Jae Song, do you think that North Koreans, Joseonjok, co-ethnics who are returning to South Korea maybe have a part to play into this larger question of South Korean multiculturalism? And then finally, what are the wider stakes in terms of human rights and civil rights for the country for this issue of multiculturalism for South Korea today?
Thank you very much, Darcy. Really good questions. There, I'll go to the back to Neil.
Hi, my name's Neil from the Australian Embassy. I had two brief questions, mostly about Korea. So Korea is already an aged society, one of the lowest birth rates in the world, if not the lowest. Population's due to start decreasing quite soon, within the next 10 years. So it seems to me that the government and people of Korea have a choice here, either to accept a declining population and potentially a declining economy, or to have a more open immigration policy. So which way do you think it's going to go in that regard over the next 10, 20 years? And the second question, I think mostly to Ms. Lee, you spoke about the growing negative sentiments around multiculturalism, particularly around older Koreans. There is this cohort of multicultural children from the marriage migrant that opened 20 odd years ago, that is going to progress through Korean society. How do you think they're going to be treated once they start entering the workforce as a large group of people? Will they be welcomed as Koreans, or will they be seen as other? Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. And I've got one last question at the front, and then we'll go to the panel, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Again, Jasmine, just to understand what do they mean by multiculturalism. I come from a multicultural society, Singapore, and so we see it very differently. And you look at what Cameron used to say, that they need muscular multiculturalism in Britain in the face of the terrorist attack. Second question to Neil on the question of young millennials across the world. Has there been a shift in public opinion? You say in Korea they are in favor, but when you see all the populist movement in Europe, they're all young people. So I just want to get a sense about the attitudes of young people over time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed for those two questions. I think, Jasmine, we'll take them through, but then you and then Jay, and then we can move to Neil in particular.
So can I do that the other way around? Can I answer you first? Because I think that's quite shorter for me. So you were asking me about what do I think is multiculturalism here in Korea, when back in 2002, when the multicultural family name was coined, which is Tamunha Kajong, when it was coined by 30 different people, it was supposed to 30 different organizations, it was supposed to mean, multicultural family is a family consisting of either a foreigner and a Korean, and a foreigner and a foreigner. But by law, by policy, as of now, as we can see, Tamunha Kajong, or multicultural family is defined as a marriage between a family consisting of a marriage between a Korean and a non-Korean. So it's by law, that's the only definition that we have out of multicultural family. Now, when you ask about multiculturalism, it actually doesn't have, by law, by policy, it doesn't have any particular definition here in Korea. So, but it's being used by the government to create projects and programs, multicultural. And then there's also the need, there's also kind of call to actually close and not use the word multicultural anymore, because multicultural families are actually thinking that it is a derogatory term, or it's a term that actually is discriminatory of all of the people. So there's also that particular problem, and that people are actually trying, those being called multicultural families are actually trying to trying to work to actually delete the word multiculturalism or multicultural family. As for the negative perceptions regarding the workforce, I think that yes, it's not even 25 years where I have 2 college students for me, so they're going to the workforce pretty soon, and I don't know if it's how they're going to be accepted by the society, but I think it will be gradual, because it will start, but it started back in 2002. There will be a lot of children going to the workforce born in 2020, so that will be 25 years from now. We think maybe 2025 or 2030. But we're actually looking forward to that, because we're looking forward to all or having these multicultural kids in the workforce, because I don't know if it's if it's gonna sound negative for you, but there are a lot of children too who are in the workforce right now, because they are not born here in Korea. We call them the 중도 입국 자녀, or they were brought here by their mothers. They were born out of the first marriage of their mother from from another country, and they were born here in Korea. They're called the 1.5 generation. It might be a different term for other countries, but here in Korea we call them the 1.5. They don't really have a Korean father, or as we say here in Korea, no Korean blood. So they come here to Korea, maybe about 10, 15 years old, and now they're actually out in the workforce. They don't go, many of them don't go to college, actually. So they go for the SMEs, they work for the SMEs, and a lot of people are actually thinking that maybe that's one way to actually generate more people going to the SMCs, or having all of this, especially the 1.5 generation going into that particular kind of workforce. But of course, it's not really ideal. We won't really know how long it's going to be. And I don't know, I think
we're actually completely out of time, Jasmine. I'm sorry.
I know.
So what I propose that we do is, we've been asked a series of questions. I'd like to give other panel members the opportunity to give some final remarks, which may include responding to questions from the floor. We will be a little bit over time, but I think that would be quite useful. So what we'll do is go Jay, Neil, Gordon, and then to Mely.
Sure. Thanks for the great question, Darcy. I think I follow you on Twitter. Great to meet you in person. The Joseon족, ethnic Korean, Chinese, or the North Korean contribution to multiculturalism. I think it depends how we define multiculturalism. Is it a French-style assimilation, or is it the more UK-style integration? If it's about becoming more like a Korean, then these 2 groups, North Koreans and Joseonjok's contribution will be quite limited, because they are considered as, one of, and they're Koreans, they speak the same language. And this whole idea about being Korean, the Koreanness is based on the speaking the same language, it's bounded by the same language. But if we want to have a real multiculturalism in South Korea, I think it has to accept more non-ethnic Korean into the society, multilingual, multicultural, multi-religion. That would be the true contribution to multiculturalism in my perspective.
Thank you, Jay.
To some of the questions, in terms of the about youth, we unfortunately don't have enough to say about the youth in terms of the questions. But I think that what the thing that was salient or significant was about the ideology. So just for instance, the question about are immigrants, do they make the country stronger? You see huge divides in many countries, especially the US where 37% on the right say only agree with that statement, whereas on the left, 83% do. But countries like Greece, they're more on agreement. Left or right, they actually don't think they make us any stronger. And again, that's probably because of the 2015 surge. And to Neil's question about the future, I mean, the future is uncertain, but you do see example of Japan. Japan has, this past month, has changed its immigration policy to make it a little bit more easier for students to work, as well as, and there's still a big question, which hopefully maybe in a future survey we plan to ask around the region, around the world, is about the issue about robots versus migrants. We haven't asked that question, but that actually is a very realistic and good question, because I think Japan and probably Korea are investing in AI, and a lot of countries around the world, and which one would you prefer? We don't have an answer for that yet, but that will help shape probably policy in the future.
In fact, if you happen to be in New York on the 6th of May, IOM will be convening an event on migration and technology, and we'll be talking about the AI impacts on migration for those people who happen to be there or who have representatives in New York at UN headquarters. Gordon, I'll pass it over to you.
I'll be very short. One, again, congratulations to Asan for putting immigration on the agenda this year. And the discussion, I think, gives indication that it needs to be on the agenda next year. So I'm seeing Choi Gong here. I'm saying immigration should be there on the agenda next year. And I would just point out 3 questions we haven't touched. Building on what Neil had just said, the whole idea of not just immigration for economic growth, but immigration for aging society.
Yes.
And so that whole question of AI, robots doing, et cetera, because the number of ethnic Koreans in China is no longer sufficient to give them, and all of a sudden, the Filipinos aren't going to be able to continue to to care for the whole world either in terms of their own demographic change, et cetera. Second question I put in the agenda for next year, what is the longer term impact of the Korean wave? You now have globally these people who are fixated on Korea, and are coming here in droves, right? That obviously is going to impact this multicultural question going forward. And the final one, the more sensitive one, goes down to this core question of race. As much as Korea has gone through this tremendous transformation in the last 20, 30 years, North Korea hasn't even begun it, right?
Yes.
And so there's a deeply entrenched, ethnocentric population that hasn't gone through that. So unification, integration, does that actually set back multiculturalism, immigration, et cetera? So.
I guess to continue where Gordon left off, what is the implication, the long-term implication of integration or whatever you call it, is really how our societies, our nations will look like in the future. I mean, most of what I'm hearing is ad hoc responses to what you do with all of this, either by marriage they come in, or how do you integrate some of these workers that come in for 5 years or 10 years. Even Japan hasn't thought about that when it decided to change its immigration policy. But what does it really mean when you accommodate all of these different individuals or different races into one space, which you call a nation? Right? We have a long experience of multiculturalization in our part of the world. It was not by choice, it's history. But even that, we grapple with these issues of, is it integration, is it assimilation? And some of those that are successfully integrated society don't talk about assimilation, it talks about really accommodation. And these are the kind of questions that will continue to haunt us even more as societies age, if you like, and as technology comes into being. And really, we forgot another issue that we should actually be talking about. We're talking about state responses. But migration and all its manifestation is not just a state business. There are other actors that need to be involved. In Japan, in Korea, your civil society groups have done a lot of things in helping societies or these immigrants integrate, right? But what about your private sector? There has to be a multiple conversation going on at the same time, because these have serious implications on how we live as human beings, or how we build our nations moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Mely. I think we've done very well in terms of getting through the number of different issues that we have been able to in really such a short period. Being a migration nerd myself, we could spend 3 days talking about these issues. So I think we've done really well. What I would just add very briefly in regards to Neil's question is 2 examples of very different approaches to ageing populations and looking at the need for migrant workers strategically. That is Hungary. And also China. I was in China last year for an event and so learned, I hadn't been to China for about 8 years, so I learnt of the considerable changes that are underway in China. In April last year, they formed their first consolidated ministry. They brought together a number of different functions on immigration and they brought it together in one authority. They're also starting to secure agreements on a bilateral level with countries like the Philippines for very large numbers of migrant workers over the coming years. 300,000 migrant workers in 6 cities, in 8 occupation groups, just from the Philippines, and those negotiations are ongoing with other countries as well. They know that they have an ageing population and they are preparing for that. Hungary has a very acute issue in regards to population decline and an ageing population. But Hungary has taken a different path, and many of you may have seen the so-called slave laws that were the subject of protests late last year, and that is mandatory overtime for workers in Hungary in recognition that the economy, particular business sectors, are in desperate need of workers. So Hungarian citizens and residents are being asked to undertake mandatory overtime to fill that gap. They've also got a number of family policies to try and increase the birth rate and so forth, and steadfastly refusing to change migration policy settings. So those are just 2 examples of very different takes, really in response to the same issue. What I would suggest is, if we look at it from a long-term perspective, in terms of national interest, we have to be really mindful of competition aspects. The competition for global talent and the competition for skilled, semi-skilled and even low-skilled in particular sectors is fierce. So that is something I think that policymakers around the world need to turn their attention to and be critical in terms of not just the current situation but future generations and what that will look like. I've had a wonderful time. It's been a really good, thank you so much to the speakers. It's been a very, very interesting and a diverse discussion that we've had. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I would certainly agree with Gordon and suggest that next year a migration panel would be wonderful because clearly there are lots of issues to discuss. What we thought that we would do, I had a discussion with Dr. Chung yesterday, is because this is a new topic for Asan, we as panel members would be willing to share short reads specifically designed for policymakers. We will coordinate on that. I've got a couple in mind, some from IOM, but one that I read on the plane coming to Seoul, which is a paper perfect for this environment. Migration is what you make it. It's a short paper written by the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. It's come out of a number of years of research. It's been led by Dr. Michael Clements, who many of you will probably know his work. And it's come off the back of 2 years of informal consultations and formal negotiations by member states in regards to the Global Compact and addressing some of the key issues that came up again and again and again, many of which we have discussed in our session today. So please put your hands together for the panel members and to Asan for asking us to be part of the plenum this year. Thank you so much.